kind of pick onto some thoughts which are just presented by Johnny about generative AI, and dive into one of the use cases we've been looking at over the past couple of years here at the Cambridge Service Alliance, which talks a bit about personalization of what has been mentioned just before as well. But personalization in one very specific area, especially in service interactions. So this is what I'm going to talk today about. I'm going to give a bit of a background of the motivation behind it and why we're looking into these elements, and then how we can use different elements of generative AI or AI in general to improve the customer experience with personalizing those interactions in service interactions. And in the end, I'll showcase a couple of examples of how we have applied these technologies and thoughts and frameworks in different use cases across different service interactions on social media, but also in call centers and in chatbot scenarios as well with automated chatbot interactions. So let me dive maybe straight into the kind of problem area or motivation behind it. So over the last couple of years, and I think everybody of us is a bit guilty of that, we've seen a customer behavior shift towards basically digital omni-channel customer service interactions, which are becoming increasingly automated. So here are just some statistics which say that, for example, 81% of customers use online self-service, such as live chats or chatbots, to communicate with a company. I think everybody of us has been going on a website and tried to figure out the problem themselves, solve the problem using a chatbot which pops up on the website, for example. And maybe also due to the fact of ChatGPT and our increased use of it, these kind of chatbots, especially for customer service or service interactions, have becoming better and better and better. And there's still a considerable quality increase we can find in those service interactions. However, the nature of us, what we found is 40% of the customers, they don't tend to only use one way of interacting with the customer, but they usually prefer multiple options of communicating, whether it's an FAQ page, live chat maybe, or a chatbot, or sometimes you just really want to call the company. But that can create significant issues. So this kind of increased automation, digitization, maybe in scenarios where companies are still struggling to kind of figure out how to do it right, leaves quite a lot of customers dissatisfied. And even if you have a customer service issue you want to have addressed and you contact the customer service, we found that in the UK, 20% of customers had a reason to complain about the interaction themselves after they have contacted the customer. And about half of the customer weren't actually satisfied with how their complaint was handled. So this shows us that while there's this kind of development towards a digitized, automated omni-channel interaction for customer service through all those multiple channels, it's not really easy to get it right, but we need to get it right in order to not drive the customer away. And one way of doing that is, or where it shows basically, is that compared to these in-person conversations, which we have when we go into the shop, when we approach a customer, maybe on the phone, those digitized solutions there are, like a chatbot again, they often lack this level of personalization, which Johnny talked about earlier as well, which we can maybe introduce with generative AI, which I'm going to talk about later. But they still rely a lot on rule-based chatbots, predefined texts, and that leaves usually us customers quite frustrated, given to, a poor reply, a standardized reply, a scripted reply. And there's a lot of research saying that we, and maybe you found it yourself as well, we can detect whether a chatbot or maybe even a live chat agent is using copy and paste solutions to solve our problem. And that's usually really driving our satisfaction low. So this is why we, as part of our research, looked into how can we personalize those interactions and really trying to bridge the gap between the kind of customer behavior shift towards digitization, automation, and omnichannel interactions, and then on the other side, managing those expectations and using AI in order to get those things right, so we don't have 50% of the customers dissatisfied and driving them away. And the way we approach this problem from a research perspective is that when we look at the interactions in service, and what we want to create is we want to increase the loyalty of the customer, maybe enable advocacy, and especially also create a resilience of the customer, as you can see on the top graph here, so that in case of service failures, they're not that easily driven away. And one way of doing that is trying to kind of improve the customer experience and create some element of customer delight. And we found that there are 6 core pillars of how we can create customer delight in service interactions or when designing the customer experience in those service interactions. They span from, getting the timing right, actually solving the problem, maybe dealing with the senses of the customer, giving them control where they need it, but also enabling some interpersonal interaction and addressing the emotions. So there are six very generic but important elements to consider when designing customer experiences. And on the bottom, we can see how, with our research, we're trying to address elements of this customer delight to really drive the emotional loyalty, advocacy, and resilience. So what we are looking at is we want to personalize those text-based interactions in digitalized sphere. So may it be a chatbot, a live chat, etc. All these interactions would happen via text. Um, we want to personalize, and we want to personalize them not only by, we talk a lot about personalization. What does it actually mean? In our research, we focus on what some might call the cherry on the ice cream, but we're focusing on how can we personalize elements on an emotional level, on an effective level. So how can we address the customer not by only solving their problem, but solving the problem in the right way and communicating according to their feelings and emotions. And by doing that, we are especially addressing these kind of three highlighted elements of customer delight. So we want to identify what is the customer emotion, how can we maybe phrase our response so that we improve the effective experience, or maybe create a frustration or transform a frustration into gratitude on an interpersonal level. And doing that for each customer in the right way requires us to get the timing right as well. So this is kind of the overall framework of how we want to bridge from the solution to the outcome in the end. So using personalized text-based interactions on an effective level to create emotional loyalty with customer delight. And now I'm going to go a bit into the research and tell you what we've found and published with one of our papers. And we developed a conceptual framework of, okay, when we talk about personalization, it's all about what do we need to know about the customer and what can we change in our interaction, our service interaction, so that we adhere to these kind of learnings about the customer and in the end improve their experience. And we found that in order to create this personal touch and personalize the interaction on this emotional level, there are certain elements we need to know about the customer. And some of them we'll only find out within the conversation, and some of them we might already know based on previous interactions. So this is how we distinguish that. It is important to know what is the initial emotion of the customer when they enter the conversation, what is the emotions when the conversations are going on, but also what is the attitude and the previous experience the customer had already along their customer journey with the firm. And considering both of them allows us to, on the other side, as I mentioned, adjust what we say to our customer. And I'm not talking about the content level in terms of being able to solve the problem, but how do we kind of wrap the present in a nice wrapping paper so that the communication addresses to those emotional needs. So we found that there are certain conversation styles which can help us to improve the communication on those digital service interactions. So they span from, using the right amount of empathy, maybe using pronouns or not, integrating humor in the conversation, small talk, social elements of a conversation. And this needs to be kind of iteratively adapted based on the knowledge we learn about the customer. So this is our framework for introducing personalization on an effective level, and I'll dive deeper into how that actually looks in practice. So for example, if we have here a customer who's contacting the company, writing, I'm calling again about my slow internet. This is really affecting my work and I can't keep dealing with this. I need a real solution now, or I'll switch providers. So the customer service complaint, and here we can, for example, figure out that A, the customer seems to be quite frustrated given that their internet is very slow, and B, it seems to be also a recurring customer who had already previous experiences because they called again. So this information can really help us in order to then tailor the communication in our response to the customer to improve their effective experience and lighten their mood, so to say. And for example, an example is here on the right-hand side. Let's imagine empathetic and data-driven communication has been found to work particularly well for this customer who is frustrated and a recurring customer. And then we can kind of ingest and learn communication styles and words we can use in order to sound more empathetic. For example, saying, I'm really sorry and I completely understand how this might impact the work, but also using maybe in this case, as an example, data-driven communication where you have some numbers and figures in order to kind of reason with the customer better. So saying our data shows a 20% decrease in your speed in area, so you kind of relate to the customer and that you can offer a 50% discount. So this is, for example, a way of how this framework can be realized. However, theory is all in good and you can sit in your box and try to think about how this should be done, but actually implementing that in practice is not very straightforward. And especially in the scenarios where you imagine the customer service agent who are kind of managing the customer calls are usually on a quite tight time constraint. They're asked to kind of reduce the time they spend with each customer, and therefore it's really difficult to kind of find the time in order to pay attention to those details, which in the end can make a significant effect in terms of loyalty and churn. However, customer service agents might struggle to identify those cues and personalize accordingly. And even if we use AI solution, we found in our research that kind of the off-the-shelf solution lack usually the effective depth and understanding of how to use certain conversation styles appropriately with different customers. And even generative AI solutions, I know we haven't touched upon the challenges yet. I think everybody's aware that they might be a concern in terms of hallucinations that can make up things, which can be quite dangerous, and therefore also create a safety concern and hindering the implementation in customer service organization. So what we found is maybe a more practical approach towards trying to bridge this gap and introducing personal touch into those conversations by personalizing the interactions is to follow a stepwise implementation across different conversational AI elements. So we found that depending on the level of automation, there are three different kinds of conversational AI you can use in order to kind of bridge this gap. And on the very left-hand side, so the least kind of automation is conversational analytics, which uses transformers, language models, and all of these advancements in the technological aspects of natural language processing as well, but solely to understand insights about the customer on the text-based level. And I'll show a showcase of how we did that previously as well. So it's about using the conversational data you have with your customer to understand, okay, what is their emotion? What can we learn about communication in those emotional states and what might or might not work? And moving further than that, we can combine these conversational analytics tools with recommendation engines to introduce a tool called conversational coaching, which can, for example, help customer service agents to find the right responses. So let's say we have found that the customer is frustrated and a reoccurring customer as we had before, then a conversational coaching tool could tell the customer service agent so they don't need to remember all of that and look it up to use more data in their communication or be more empathetic, for example, building on our example before. And on top of that, I think something everybody is kind of striving towards too, but again, needs to be handled with care so that that customers are not driven away is kind of the full automation of those customer interactions using chatbots, which can automatically learn the previous steps and integrate that by not only recommending the right kind of phrase, but automatically implementing it and communicating with the customer. So these are kind of the three steps of conversational AI from which you can kind of move on to automating those digital interactions while maintaining the personal touch in order to increase the emotional loyalty. And again, just to bring this into practice here, I think we have the same example. What can conversational analytics do? In this case, conversational analytics can help you to understand the customer's frustration from the text and identify that they have already purchased the service and are a recurring customer. Conversational coaching can guide to kind of switch to an empathetic and data-driven response style. And a natural language generation model or a conversational agent can kind of automatically respond and carry out the conversation really. And just because of the topic of today's talk, I want to talk a bit about the generative AI solutions because I'm aware that conversational analytics doesn't necessarily involve any generative AI. It uses advanced levels of natural language processing, which, however, doesn't mean that there aren't any opportunities for generative AI. So in our scenario, generative AI is was previously mentioned as well, is about kind of creating new content, might it be in written text, audio, video, etc. And for our conversational analytics, it could, for example, be enhanced using generative AI to, for example, summarize those findings. So if you have a lot of data showing the emotions at different stages of the conversation, etc., using this data, feeding it into a language model, which can then produce a summary, could be very handy in order to kind of train and coach your customer service agents. But you can also use generative AI, for example, to create contextualized synthetic data. So if you know you want to train your kind of classification models for emotion and sentiment, then using generative AI to create sample data based on existing data. So for example, just to increase the training data side could be very handy. So conversational coaching and chatbots are building more and more on kind of this generative AI solution. So here we already have some generative AI implemented, but having real-time suggestion engines based on generative AI could really help in order to kind of create maybe varied and situation-specific communication strategies, which can help to kind of coach the the customer service agent in order to learn better and more appropriately in what to respond. And then again, chatbots are already implementing a lot of natural language generation and therefore generative AI in order to automatically produce a response, which can then be tailored and personalized towards the customer information. Okay, so this is all about the theory. I now want to use the second half of the talk to talk a bit more about how we've used the theory, about how to personalize, what to learn about the customer, and how to change our conversation style across three different use cases. So we've done three projects with this and tried to figure out, okay, how do we actually most appropriately personalize the interactions? And I mentioned the conversation styles such as empathy, small talk, varied lexical, so moving away from predefined and standardized responses. And we tried to find evidence and support in that in three different kinds of customer service interactions. One with over 30,000 conversations on social media. Then we've done experiments with over 250 chatbot interactions, but also call center studies where we have looked at the transcripts. Maybe let me start with the social media study where we had a look into the social media accounts, the customer service accounts of the 15 case companies you can see on the right-hand side across different industries. So we had retail, telecommunication, banking, airline, and the study design on the left-hand side shows that we have looked at three different conversation styles and looked how they affect the customer experience, especially the effective customer experience, and how that effect might change depending on what we know about the customer, so their emotions and previous experiences, for example. And we found that expressing, for example, small talk and social information during the digital customer service interactions can improve the effective customer service experience. And there's just an example below where a customer noticed that his bill was higher. So if the customer service representative introduces some kind of purposeful follow-up questions, which is not 100% directed towards solving the customer issue, so this is what we classified as small talk, and that can actually drive the emotional development towards a positive balance and increase the effective customer experience. Another example is, for example, that, or another finding is that while we found that standardized responses are driving the customer away and creating negative customer experiences, we found that this is particularly true in the middle and the end of the conversation, but interestingly, not at the beginning. So you might as well start your first message or your initial customer response to a customer service interaction with a standardized greeting, as you can see on the top left-hand side here. However, if you continue using standardized responses while the conversation goes on, this is when you're really driving away the customer, and which is why they really feel underappreciated and their customer experiences plummets quite significantly. So these are two very significant findings from our social media study. But as I mentioned, we looked in even more detail on how these findings can be personalized. So just to give you a little glimpse of what the findings are, we found, for example, that previously, maybe less surprisingly, previously positive experience can mitigate negative effects of lexical similarity. So if the customer already had quite a lot of positive interactions with the company, then you can get away with more standardized responses, so to say. And that kind of draws back to what we said at the beginning, that when you get customer delight and customer experience right, you also increase the service resilience and that the customer resilience, and that sometimes even if conversations are bad, they're not driving the customers away too much. We also found that small talk, for example, works better with customers who experience frustration compared to other emotions, quite interestingly. But also that if the customer are angry, then using cognitive empathy, a certain type of empathy works really well for them. But also, if the customer is angry and use affective empathy, a different type of empathy, then that effect becomes even worse than normally. So we found that in general, what matters a lot is the customer emotion, the previous experience, and then the location of where you actually express those conversation styles. So that's in the beginning, in the middle, and in the end of the conversation. So we took all of those findings and then went to companies and their call center interactions. And we had a kind of a case study with them. We looked at their transcript, did some analysis, and really tried to implement some conversational coaching for them. So moving on to previously, we've done a lot of conversational analytics. Now we're moving on to conversational coaching. And on the left-hand side, you can see some graphs. We looked into personality profiles. We looked into different conversation styles and how much standardized responses they use, how much empathy they use, how much data-driven communication they use, and then found some specific instructions for the agents, which could help them actually to improve the customer experience, such as introducing small talks in the greeting stage, but also tailoring data-driven communication to previous customers, especially the ones who might be confused and need a lot more guidance than before. So these were kind of two successful implementation of the findings before in a different use case, which is call center conversations. And then the third bit I want to talk about today is chatbots and generative AI. So what we've done here is we looked at the findings from our previous studies and see whether we can replicate them in chatbot scenarios as well. So what we did here is we engineered some specific prompts to a GPT API to figure out, can they follow the conversation styles accordingly, and how does the customer react to it? So here, for example, is an example of how we instructed a conversational AI or the generative AI ChatGPT to be more empathetic. So there were a set of other instructions in the prompt, but these are the ones specifically for the conversation styles. And say you're highly empathetic, you communicate an understanding, and you express emotional reactions. So this is how we try to build an empathetic chatbot, so to say. And let me see if I can quickly play this. So this is just a screen recording of how the chatbot behaved in that scenario, which we then investigated to see whether the conversation increases the affective experience, so the emotion, etc. And here we can see that the customer service agent already kind of introduces some elements of empathy. For example, I'm sorry to hear that you experience slow internet. And especially here, I understand how frustrating and inconvenient that can be. I think that is a response which wasn't previously apparent when we used the normal chatbot. And then even when the customer kind of followed up a question, it's still kind of tries to convey this level of empathy. Again, I understand how frustrating and disruptive this can be. Slow internet speed can cause, and it goes on and kind of stop the problem. So this was one example of how we managed to prompt engineer an empathetic chatbot for the specific case, and then to investigate how it affected the customer experience. And lots of the findings I mentioned previously were replicated for this chatbot scenario case as well. I don't know if the next answer again kind of apologizes for any inconvenience. So this is more of an empathetic chatbot. I also want to show you a second example here. So this is a prompt engineered chatbot for data-driven experiences where we used, we tried to create a chatbot which specifically focuses now on data-driven communication in order to personalize the interactions with the customer. And here again, is a question I've experienced really. So internet, so it's kind of the same scenario or example we had in the previous sessions. And And the chatbot apologizes first, and then it's the heart of the conversation where it goes on when I said, not at the greeting stage, it can be quite standardized, but then you kind of need to introduce some more personalized elements in the conversation here. It uses some numbers like a 75% reduction and 100%, 100 MBPs. I'm aware this is now based on kind of prompt engineered data, so there's no real data behind it, but new technologies such as function calling, for example, from OpenAI's GPT model make it possible to kind of connect even your generative AI chatbot with specific data in order to kind of solve the customer problem more appropriately. So these were basically the three kind of case studies and examples of how we can introduce more personal touch and overcome this gap between digitization, automation, and still remaining having a personal touch and creating emotional loyalty in those very important interactions. And just I'll finish the talk and then open some questions if there are some with kind of a checklist towards introducing this personal touch and kind of implementing the frameworks we talked about before to kind of replicate the same findings within the organization. So I think the first thing to do first is kind of assess the maturity of the own available technology. So going back to the kind of 3 steps of conversational AI, I recommend to kind of follow them step by step rather than diving deep into the chatbot and trying to figure out whether you can kind of automate everything in the right way, which might or might not create a lot of problems straight. So that's the first thing. Then using conversational analytics to have a look into which conversation styles work for your organization. So we found that sometimes for some industries and some companies, certain conversation styles were far more important than others. Obviously, this depends on the customer as well, but also on the customer group and industry you're interacting with. And then based on that, you can start integrating large language model capabilities along the kind of dynamic stages of conversational AI, and then gradually start allocating kind of interactions to the chatbot, so having automated resolving the issues rather than bringing it back to the customer service agent, where maybe even a personal touch might be necessary in terms of talking to an agent or speaking to a real agent, which doesn't use standardized responses. But it's also an iterative loop. So this all closes again when you start kind of collecting more high quality data we talked about before. The more conversational data you have, the more annotated conversational data you have about the customer profile, their emotion, their personality, etc. The more you can obviously fine tune and train your model to your specific use case, and it becomes more and more appropriate and stronger for your own solution, and therefore kind of the capabilities of these models keep increasing depending on what you gather about the customer. But first, you got to kind of know what the customers are talking about. And yeah, so that was a little in a nutshell what we've been working on for a couple of years now, and I hope you got an idea of how you maybe can use generative AI or other solutions of conversational AI to introduce some personal touch and especially improve the emotional elements of the service interactions in the digital sphere. Perfect. Thank you very much. I think the QR code is to my LinkedIn. But if you have any questions, let me know or drop me an email as well.